Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Lindmark, and you are listening to The Reese Show. On the show, we're trying to clarify what a good future looks like. I know we're all a bit sad about late-stage capitalism, and we want to transition to something, but we don't really know what's next. So, on the show, we interview experts about what is emerging, this beautiful future vision that we can all lean into. I hope it gives you a sense of purpose and clarity about the future. If you like the show, feel free to do something about it. You can leave us a 5-star review. You can tell your friends. You can name your first child Reese. Whatever makes you happy. And if you really dig it, we have an online school called Root, where we help folks understand these root level systems to find our route forward. We have cohorts of world-class systems thinkers that run every couple of months. So if you're interested in that, check us out at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. Thanks. Hello, listeners. Today I'm excited to chat with César Hidalgo. César is a Chilean-Spanish-American scholar in economic complexity, data visualization, and applied artificial intelligence. And he's written some great books that we'll chat about today, like Why Information Grows and How Humans Judge Machines. César, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to dive in. César and I were chatting about this before the show, but there's kind of like 3 big things that we kind of want to dive into today. There's César's a great visual thinker, and so I want to kind of understand that because I would like to be a better one and I'm a natural one, but I think you do a great job of it. And then also to dive into your books. But let's start with that visual thinking side of things. As I was watching one of your talks last night, it was like you had shown there are just so many amazing examples of this visual thinking that you do, whether it's graphing things in 2 and 3 dimensions or whether it is your project Data Wheel, I think, is that the name of it, where you and then the Journal of Economic Complexity. You just do this amazing job. Or let me give one other example for our listeners, which I think was really cool. You gave this talk at Google with Talks at Google for how humans judge machines. And at the end of the talk, you put up a picture on screen of all the pages of your book, and then you highlighted the different pages that you had covered in that talk. And you're like, hey, this is what we covered today, but there's also all this other stuff, And it was just a cool way to kind of see the visuals. So tell me a little bit more about how you think in visuals and how that ends up being portrayed to others.
So in some way, my main concern is always, to communicate. My fear is the fear of not being understood. And I try to fight that fear in different ways. I try to find that fear, by trying to be as simple as possible when I write. But also, I realize that, writing has some inherent limitations. And the main limitation of writing is that writing is linear. When you speak, when you write, when you watch a movie, you cannot avoid having one thing come before the other. There is this linear component to narratives. And that is great if you're able to linearize your thoughts properly. But in reality, that's a very difficult process because the way that our mind works, or at least the way that it feels that it works, it's sometimes in parallel. Sometimes you get hit by a stimuli and you start thinking about multiple possibilities. So I like to use visuals when I try to communicate things that have that property that it's more something in parallel than something linear, when you want to look at multiple things at the same time and compare them. And I think that's what visuals are able to do well, is to tap into this other mode of thinking in which, you have comparisons from sizes to shapes to, positions and so forth that are very cumbersome to communicate in writing. Writing is not bad at describing geometries or systems or networks and all of those things. And sometimes those diagrams, that are able to show things simultaneously do that job much better. So I think both my writing and my use of visualization stem from the same fear, is the fear of not being understood. But when it comes to writing, I try to make sure that I always say what I'm going to use before I use it. When it comes to visuals, I try to use it when I try to communicate something that involves that parallel type of thinking.
Yeah, I love it. I think, and it's funny because, for you and for me to some extent, being in this field of, complex systems and networks and stuff like that, those things are so much better to convey visually, like a feedback loop or, a network graph or whatever. It's like, hey, you could say every little bit of the feedback loop, but it's kind of easier for the listener or for, the viewer to just check it out and be like, oh, okay, this is how it works. Here's like the loop here, here's the loop there. And they kind of like get it more intuitively. Is there something, so I think that it's funny because I think your work itself probably is kind of like, it lends itself well to visualization. Do you think that there's what in your mind makes something like a great data visualization?
I think at the end, of course, it has to have a strong, take home message. Like sometimes visualizations can be, very simple, but the power that they have is the topic that they're representing, or the aspect of the topic that they highlight. I think that's one part of it. The other part of it, which I think it's really important, is that it has to be memorable too. And that's kind of challenging because a lot of the times the visualizations that are very memorable, they have to be a little bit more unique. And it's hard to be unique without introducing things that might be decorative or unnecessary, but sometimes you can have something as simple as a bar chart with a very powerful point that you're trying to make, but it's not memorable and might be forgotten. So I think like you want to hit both. You want to hit like a core important message, but you also want to try to create something that is memorable, because at the end that's what we're trying to create. We're not trying to just create impressions, but we're trying to create long lasting impressions.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, okay, if you give a talk or whatever, and then people only get, they're like, oh, that's kind of a cool visual, and then it just leaves their mind immediately. It's like, you didn't really do your job or whatever. And so it's like, I guess when you think about that fear, there's both the fear of communicating and being, or like of being understood, and there's this also bonus double fear, which would be like the fear of only being understood for a day instead of for the ideas to go into the mind forever or something.
Of course.
I think this makes me think too, like for you, a lot of your work, it comes across, there's, you've worked at the Media Lab, you're now in Toulouse, and your work goes in a lot of different directions in a very like interdisciplinary way. How do you think, what is like the through line in your mind that ties all of your work together?
So there's a few, but to me, basically the thing that connects my work is to understand the geography of how knowledge is being produced and how knowledge diffuses and how that impacts society in numerous ways. So for instance, if you look at the work that I've done on economic complexity and relatedness, that it's all about how we can use administrative records such as a custom data like for imports and exports, or employment data for industries and occupations, or patent data or research paper data, to understand the geography of knowledge and its dynamics. But if you look, for example, at the work that we did with Pantheon, Pantheon.world is a website that basically helps visualize a data set that looks at cultural exports. It looks at the famous people produced by a country rather than the products that the country exports. And in that case, we had to, for example, create that data set using NLP and apply that on Wikipedia, to structure the data. Then we use that data to study the effect of, for instance, technologies in the creation of knowledge. We found very strong effects with the introduction of printing, radio, film, television, and how those technologies change the type of culture that is produced at a time period and remembered until today. We also use that data set to explore the role of languages and translations in the diffusion of knowledge and information across the world. And in that context, I think from that core, we start exploring different ideas. So, for instance, how human judge machines start exploring also the ideas like, well, as we develop knowledge and we create a more complex society in which the technology that we create it starts to transcend the idea of just being a tool and it starts becoming a member of teams. How do people react to those and how we accept them into our groups? And that's a little bit like what the book explores by comparing how people, judge machines compared to humans doing the same thing. So to me, that's kind of like the core. But at the same time, I like exploring new stuff. I'm a person that is very open to experience. So if I find like a new idea, if I find a new collaborator that I'm having fun talking about and working, and there's something that we can do. I do believe on the journey itself too, not just on the destination. So I would deviate, and a lot of the things that sometimes I find have been more gratifying have come through those deviations.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that, some of the work you've done on geography of knowledge was really cool. Just to like highlight one piece of that for the listeners, it was, you can look at how many people are cited in like a Wikipedia page, like how many Wikipedia pages there are for people. And before the printing press, there was like not very many. And then after the printing press, it was like, oh, wow, now like we as a society remember the people more. Is that kind of one of the takeaways? Is like getting that right?
Yeah. So for example, prior to printing, you find that most of the people that we have in a record like the Wikipedia, and we use a criterion in which we focus only on people that are present in many languages to try to find people that have like a level of global fame. It's people involved in religious activities, or people that basically were on political positions, whether it's a king or a marquis, or some sort of governor or person of power at the time. After printing, what is interesting is that not only the number of people that we remember jumps, meaning that kind of like our collective memory about doubles, very quickly, but also the new people that we remember is people in different categories. So the introduction of printing was the start of society remembering composers and artists and astronomers and mathematicians. And as printing develops, and we go from printing books to starting to print journals, a process that takes a couple of 100 years to take place, actually. Then the sciences start to bloom, and you start kind of like seeing, sciences grow, by dividing, the natural philosophy sciences into, physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. And then all of a sudden you have the introduction of film and radio, and that completely shifts the arts from the playwrights and the composers to the performers, to the actors, to the musicians, to the singers. And it resonates very strongly with this idea from Marshall McLuhan that the medium is the message, which is that as you develop new technologies to communicate things, there are certain messages that are better adapted to those mediums, and those are the ones that end up spreading further and farther. So actors existed at the time of the Greeks. Actors existed, of course, at the time of Shakespeare, but famous actors only existed when there was a medium that was able to capture the performance. When there was a medium that was only able to capture the play, it was the playwright, the one that became famous. And that is really interesting because it tells us that these technologies are really transformative. They shape our society. They really show that there are these breaks in our history that are the result of changes in communication technology.
Yeah, I love that. To double click on that for a second, what do you see? This is a very macro question, but good luck. From a medium as the message perspective, what do you see as what things are optimized for the internet?
The internet is weird because it's such a kind of like a multimedia. I know that sounds like a really 90s word, but it's true, that you have video, you have audio, you have text, and so forth. The web, nevertheless, has a lot of text. Like when you look at a medium like Twitter or Facebook and so forth, even though there is video, a lot of it is like little headlines and so forth. And in our data set, we start to see a few things. Some of which might sound ridiculous, but I think they show that at least the technique makes sense. For instance, with the rise of the internet, we're starting to see in data set, of course, like famous YouTubers, but for instance, you also see like famous porn stars, like there is a rise, and if, whether you like it or not, the internet and porn had kind of like some sort of connected history. Like a lot of the compression algorithms and everything were developed originally, in the context of that industry. Also, I think the internet has given like some sort of revival to a different type of politics that we're seeing across the world. Like I say that today we're in this sort of weird Twitterocracy, because the fact that the politicians have like direct access to their audiences vis-a-vis 30 years ago when it had to be through interviews or through a TV channel, developed a politics that is much more untapped, much more aggressive. In the United States, we basically saw that when Trump was removed from Twitter. That was kind of like the real like Twitter was able to do sometimes in a way an action that seemed to be more decisive on changing the mood and the landscape than the impeachment attempts that didn't go through. So it's kind of weird, and we're seeing this pop up all over the world. So I do think we're kind of like in this weird space in which we have a technology that allows people to have direct, instant fame. The fame is not mediated through, like a work or through, people other than you writing about it, and that has generated kind of like a very strange, dynamic on people that become famous by sharing opinions, sharing conspiracies. People that also become famous because they're good at explaining difficult things and they provide a good service. So it's hard to judge when you have such a mixed bag. But I think definitely it's not the same as what we had 20, 30 years ago.
Totally. Yeah, I think that it is funny. Yeah, it's multimedia. All these multimedia people on the information superhighway. It's crazy out there, but I agree with a lot of what you're saying, which is the disintermediation and the ability to speak directly to your audience is really crazy. It also makes me think, something else that you talk about and why information grows is this leveling up of networks. As if we think about the various information processors in the world, and whether it's our bodies as an information processor and our minds as an information processor, and then we go up like from a person byte up to like a firm byte, where you have all the things that we can keep in our head are not enough, and so we like get into these firms with lower transaction costs and higher trust in order to kind of process information better. And then you can kind of zoom out again another level to, what about these network of firms or whatever? And so I think that's something that I want to get your take on, is like on the internet, do you see any kind of like new institutional forms like that showing up, or how do you think about that side of things?
I do see attempts, and I'm interested on not only understanding them but participating in their creation, because I think from the beginning, the internet has always had, a component of a democratic utopia in some way. Like I remember when I started to use the internet, like in 94, 95, a lot of the allure of the internet was like, this is a space that is in some sense outside of the traditional establishment. You can create your own server if you want. You can create your own email server if you want. You can create your newsletter. And it was an internet that was basically based on protocols. It was much more decentralized than the internet of today. But as the internet developed commercially, that platform, that had been generated, in some way got cleverly privatized by companies that dominated key applications. Search, social, mail, maps, and so forth. And the internet transformed into an internet of protocols, into an internet of platforms or aggregators, which are technically different, that now control a large amount of the traffic. So sure, there's a lot of websites on the internet, but the big websites, the big platforms explain a lot of people's traffic. A lot of the thing goes there, and if you're not getting traffic through search or through social, you're not getting traffic. It's kind of like a tough world out there now. So in that context, I think the internet became a little more centralized, and there's kind of like power on those platforms when it comes to like the decisions that they make about how they operate, who gets to participate, what forms of participation are allowed, and so forth. At the margin of that, though, there are still people that I think have stuck to that utopia of the internet as a medium for democracy. During this semester at the Center for Collective Learning, I ran a seminar series. I interviewed people I invited people to participate in the seminar, like Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister of Taiwan, the people from the 5-Star Movement in Italy, that they had this platform Rousseau that they use, some people, from Spain that had created the Decide Madrid, which was a big participatory budgeting initiative, hundreds of millions of euros, and a little bit what I see is that, there are a lot of isolated efforts, and there are attempts to kind of like create these new institutions. On the one hand, I think we're a little bit underdeveloped when it comes to like the HCI of those institutions. I think a lot of the friction sometimes come from bad user interface, and that's something that, in my group we try to explore. Doing good user interface is very costly, because you have to make a lot of decisions a priori that the users a posteriori they don't appreciate much, because for them the result is that it's easy.
That's
So
funny.
it feels that, like it was easy to make, but I always tell people, like, a BMW is easy to drive, it's not easy to build. you know so you have a little bit of that. I think there's a lot of kind of like ideas, and unfortunately, when you kind of like go to the more official channels, a lot of those efforts, or the people that are sympathetic to those efforts, they think that they can create those institutions and technologies by kind of like by decree, or by agreeing on, like some course values and ideas, and from there to an actual implementation that is engaging, useful, fair, and so forth, is such a long road, that we need people working on that other side of like trying and erring and exploring and building, and there's few, but they're not zero, they're growing, and it's also something that I see that is very much alive among younger generations that are digital natives each time, more and more, and that, tend to, believe that the internet is kind of not just another medium, but an integral part of society that should be, of course, a part of the way that we make collective decisions, let's say democracy.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, yeah, if you have like some Gen Z kid who kind of grows up and they're like doing their thing, they're part of a Minecraft group where everybody kind of like co-builds things together, and they're part of these Discord servers, and they're like doing all these things that are very like, and they're remixing on TikTok or whatever. And then they grow up and they're like, they turn 18 or 21 or whatever, and they're like, oh, now I get to vote and I get to give one bit of information every 4 years. They're like, is that really how this works? So yeah, I think that they get disappointed by that. Let me ask you one other question on this, and then we can switch topics, which is, do you think that there's like, I agree with your version here, which is, okay, there's this like democratic utopia, like bottom up, gov tech, civ tech thing, this great way to kind of process information better as a society, especially around this kind of like governmental side of things. The other side here is like, kind of these new kind of institutions, and I'm not sure if institution is the right term for them, but something like a hashtag or a movement, whether it's Me Too or Black Lives Matter or something like MAGA or Stop the Steal, where people are kind of, they come in because there's lower friction. You can kind of like understand and get in as part of these networks, and then that like thing, that new kind of being, that new shared myth can kind of help propel folks forward. There's like that side of things, and there's also like this other side of things, like you're probably part of complexity Twitter, or economic complexity Twitter, or AI Twitter or whatever. And so that's kind of like a new kind of social, it's like a new group that didn't exist before. It's kind of like it's like a network or something like that. And so I'm curious about these new kinds of like in the past, we've had firms and nation states and markets and stuff. And I just think that there might be some like network native kinds of institutions that will pop up that use lower transaction costs and higher trust with the kind of new medium. Does that make sense? Do you have any thoughts on the network first?
I do believe, of course, that there is like some sort of online geography that doesn't map like immediately to the physical geography. So we participate of groups that are tightly knit in terms of relationships, but can be quite distributed in terms of their physical location. But the technology that we have right now, I think, are great at some things. Like of course there is the ability to express yourself, but they're so bad at other things, like trying to aggregate those preferences, doing some minimal form of participation, doing proper deliberation and debate, that as those movements grow, the only way for them to survive is to find a very simplified topic or language, and in some sense that's kind of like how the larger idea that has more nuance gets killed. At night I've been reading my daughter Animal Farm from George Orwell, and I read that book when I was a teenager, and I've been reading it again, and honestly it's such a fantastic book. And like basically as the revolution moves on in the farm, Napoleon and Snowball, which were like the two pigs that are running the revolution in the beginning, have this set of rules about the principles of animalism. And they soon discovered that there's some animals that could learn to read and write, that other animals that could learn the alphabet, and there are other animals, like the sheep, that were really stupid. And so they had to start to dumb down those principles, and it ends up being 2 legs bad, 4 legs good. And what starts in the book, with the speech of Mayer, the pig that makes the big speech on chapter 1 and dies on chapter 2, like it starts like this, more nuanced, of course, revolutionary idea. Then it gets dumbed down, as it needs to be spread within the animal farm society. And I think, of course, Orwell was doing a satire of what he observed happen in reality. And I think Twitter has changed the world, Facebook has changed the world, but that mechanism seems to be still in place.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think on 2 points. One is, as you say, it's like we're so good at everybody can, express themselves and kind of yell about whatever they want to, but then how we actually aggregate that or, curate it is so bad. It's so just we have this beautiful, obviously it's like a fire hose of information, but then when you actually try to get that down and have it be helpful for coordination or aggregating information, all these things, there's some beautiful things like Wikipedia that do it in a really good way, but all things considered, I super agree that we're just at the beginning there, and we're only at the place right now where, because of our tools, it kind of gets, cut down into a very small space, that doesn't have much nuance. So, well, curious about how that evolves over time. Let's chat about how humans judge machines now.
Sure.
And I think that at a high level, tell us a little bit more about the main thesis of the book, and then we'll kind of dive into a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So basically, the book was motivated by the fact that a lot of people were, talking about the effects of AI in society, and to me, it felt like that conversation was incomplete because a lot of those judgments that were being shared or communicated didn't have proper counterfactuals. So, like in reality, I am a big believer that things always have to be understood in some context. They have to be understood in comparison to something. So people would say, well, this machine is really harmful, or this is bad to society, or is it unfair? But wait, those same tasks are now being executed by humans. How are the humans doing it? And if the human make the same mistakes, do we judge them equally? So because of that, I decided to create a small team. I did those experiments while I was at MIT. I had 2 postdocs that were social psychologists, and we created a list of a little bit over 80 experiments in which we had a scenario in which a machine or a human performed the same action, and then we had people react to that scenario. And we use a clinical trial type of study design in which we randomly assign people to the machine condition or the human condition. So to give you a super vanilla example, imagine that there is an excavator that is digging up a site for a building. The site contains a grave, and the excavator digs it up. Well, there were 200 people that thought that was the action of a machine, and there were a separate group of 200 people that thought that was the action of a human. And those people are all independent. They're not deliberating. They're just giving us their reactions. We look at those averages and we see, okay, did people find the action of the machine to be more harmful than when the same action was performed by a human? Or did they find it more morally incorrect? Do they feel more identified with the human action, thinking that they would have done the same if they would have been in that situation? And we find, differences, across the board in many experiments. In some, we don't find differences. And at the end of the book, what we do is we put all of the data from all of the experiments together to try to understand is it just a preference for humans over machines, or if there's something deeper going on. And we find that there's something much deeper going on, which is that people are judging humans and machines through different moral philosophies. So we tend to judge humans with a moral philosophy that would be called more Kantian. Basically, it's more about your motivation, more about your intentions, and hence, we tend to forgive humans in accidental scenarios. But we tend to judge machines through a different moral philosophy that is utilitarian, that is more consequentialist. So we only care about the outcome. We don't care, about what the machine was trying to do or what it was designed to try to do. It's only whether it fails or not. So, we have these different moral philosophies, and that helps explain a lot of the differences that we observe in a scenario. For instance, people are unforgiving of machines in scenarios that are clearly, the fault of an exogenous factor. We had scenarios where there was a tsunami that, basically destroyed a town, or a car that has to swerve to avoid a falling tree. So that are exogenous trigger. People still tend to be less forgiving to machines in accidental scenarios because they're judging it through a different moral philosophy that is consequentialist rather than Kantian.
Yeah, I love that. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's like, hey, it's like, oh, there's a human over there. Oh, they didn't really intend for that to happen. Like they're a good, or like, they were just trying their best or whatever. And I can understand the mistake. Versus the machine, it's like, well, the machine messed up. It's like, it's not like the machine was trying its best or whatever. Like that's a weird frame to take. I guess it's kind of like, do you have an instinct of, like, you got this result, this, normative result that was like, okay, humans, we judge each other based on this Kantian intention thing, and we judge humans based off this utilitarian outcome thing. Do you think that is like right? Or like if you think about the outcomes of this, are you going to try to, like, if possible, like shift how we think and how we judge machines? Or if you could, how would you do that? Or what would you want the goal to be?
That per se, those things are right or wrong. I think they can be used rightly or wrongly. So let me give you some examples. So in chapter 7 of the book, after having done all of the data analysis, I take the liberty to speculate a little bit and talk about implications. And one of the things that I talk about is, okay, so beyond humans and machines, we have organizations. Organizations are another type of structure that also makes decisions, execute actions, but it's not like judging an individual when you're judging the Coca-Cola company or the US government or the US Army. It's very different than judging an individual. Yet, for instance, when it comes to government approval is basically a synonym of presidential approval in countries that have a presidentialist type of regime, and that is sort of a little bit weird because in some way, the organizations are so large that a lot of the time the outcomes might be very different from the intentions of the leaders or the people involved. So to me, it seems that we tend to transport our intention-based form of moral judgment to organizations when those organizations are more political and they have like leaders to which we ascribe a lot of responsibility. So my speculation there is that we judge something like the US government using a similar judgment that we do for humans. Is like, no, this policy proposal is wrong because I don't trust Trump or because I don't trust Biden. So basically I'm interpreted from the perspective of the intentions that I associate to that person or to that party. I don't trust the conservatives. I don't trust the liberals. But when we're thinking about a company in the private sector where we don't know who the CEO is and everything, we tend to use a more utilitarian approach, in part because it is easier to measure the quality of the product. So hey, like Disney movies are really good, man. They do a fantastic job at animation, storytelling. Like they're tight. Like Apple makes great products, and whether it's Tim Cook the CEO or not, like in some sense you don't see the product to be like it's because like Microsoft doesn't do such a nice operating system because they're not trying to do it right. No, it's like, like the outcome at the end is hard and it's also more directly measurable for you as a consumer, while, measuring whether you're getting good government services or not, it's a little bit more difficult, and that's why we might be using these different modes, So I go a little bit into that. So now the question is, should we be judging governments by their intentions or should we judge them by the outcomes? And I think that's a very deep question because intentions are much easier to fake and communicate. and outcomes require capacity. So sure, you can have someone that comes and says, like, oh yeah, I'm here for everybody that is poor and desperate, and it tries to touch all your sensibilities. But when push comes to shove and they have to do something about it, they don't have the capacity. And you can have someone that is more of a policy wonk that knows all of the constraints and how difficult it is to do something. And you can say, well, actually, we cannot just give you free everything for everyone, but maybe this is what we can do. And that person politically might have a lower chance of becoming elected or moving up, the political ladder, because they are going more into the technicalities instead of just trying to talk to people's intentions and so forth. And we might end up then with lower quality governments, because the institutions get captured, but those that are able to touch our sensitivities, and not necessarily by those that are able to achieve the outcomes.
Yeah. It's kind of it's like a classic government thing where it's like they're signaling blah, 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 or they're saying blah, blah, they're making these pledges. And then in the end, it's like, well, what is actually happening? And it is, especially with something like the internet, where it's just like, you can state directly to your people in kind of a populist way, oh, we're going to be amazing for all of you. And then, okay, what actually happens on the policy side? So it does seem like it would be nicer if we judged folks based off of, judge governments based on their outcomes. And this gets into things like prediction markets and stuff like that, where you would be able to, they say and make pledges and then might get, incentivized or disincentivized based on the, either prediction market outcomes or things like that might be one okay way to do this. Do you think, thinking about the moral side of things here, and it was cool that in your book you use like these Haidt moral foundations a lot in terms of how humans judge machines. Do you think, were there any big differences you saw in kind of there's like the care and harm based side of things and some of the more individual side, and then there's these more kind of collectivist or group ones like sanctity or loyalty or authority. Were there any kind of big differences between those two that you saw in the data?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. On the one hand, we find for moral dilemmas that involve harm, people tend to immediately be very unforgiving towards machines. So when it comes to harm, machine bad, human good. When it comes to fairness, it's a little more complicated, because when people look at a situation that is unfair and involves a human, they tend to judge that human very harshly. They consider those things to be very bad. They consider those things to be very intentional. And in those cases, machines sometimes get a little bit of a break, a tiny little bit, but a little bit of a break. So let me give you an example. Like, we had one scenario in which there was a human or a machine that would write songs for artists. They would kind of like write, songs for singers. And later, a journalist discovers that, the algorithm or, this songwriter had been plagiarizing, songs from lesser known artists. In that case, people, basically see the machine as like, okay, this is like a machine learning case go bad, and they tend to forgive it compared to the human that plagiarized. In that case, it's sort of like, hey, you know what you were doing, it's bad, while in the case of harm, you don't see the same. We also found, for example, in some loyalty examples, we find that people also tended to judge humans more harshly. We have a scenario that is borrowed from Haidt's work, in which there is a cleaner or a robot that uses a flag to clean a bathroom floor. So that's sort of like a very complex type of moral transgression. You have to understand that this flag from this country is bad to these people, like if it's used that way and so forth. And in that case, people judge, the action of the human as less morally correct, but we did other scenarios that try to explore transgression that also touch upon, patriotism, nationalism in some way. So, for instance, we had someone interrupting, a national anthem on a sporting event. In that case, we find, a very small effect, almost, doesn't matter. And then, for example, we had another one in which we had someone like playing the wrong national anthem for a country in an international sport event. In that case, there was no difference. Like people, didn't see the action of the machine as worse than that of the human, and they were actually not very upset at it. So there is a lot of variation to explore, I think, still, but definitely the different moral dimensions did affect the way that these judgments behave. And in the case of harm, fairness, pretty consistent effect. In the case of loyalty, authority, purity, not so much. And also, it is much harder to construct the scenarios in which someone is betrayed by an algorithm. So they're harder to make at least sound plausible. And I think that's part of one of the things that we struggle with.
Yeah, that's interesting. It just makes me think too of like the long-term view here, where things like loyalty, authority, sanctity kind of were created within society and humans as a result of our kind of, groupishness desires to create these both tribal groups and then city states and these like larger entities where it was like, oh, it is good to be loyal. It is good to be, to defer to authority in some ways. And I don't know, it makes me think about, the long-term future here with machines and how, yeah, it's harder to kind of loop them into those more complex scenarios, and that like maybe as machines continue to do more and more, I don't know, that like, yeah, that maybe some sense of the groupishness or the moral capital there will kind of start to diminish, and we'll just become like utilitarians all the time. So I'm not sure about that, but well, one final question I have for you with how humans judge machines is: do you think that I noticed that you're giving away the PDF for free on the website, but you're also selling the book through MIT Press, and the book, by the way, it is this beautiful, these illustrations talking about the visual side of things. It's really, really cool there. How were you able to like, giving away a book for free as a PDF and also selling it usually doesn't work for the publisher. So how was MIT Press okay with that, or why did you choose to do that?
I had to pay the publisher the cost of the first run. So like basically, I said like I want to do the book. Like honestly, like it was a bit complicated because I wanted to get the book out quickly because I had done all of the experiments. I could write fast if I had the chance. And basically what I was telling them is like, look, I want to have this book done by the end of 2019, and then, I pay for the run because the only thing that I'm sort of getting from you guys is the peer review service. Like the book is peer review by anonymous peer reviews outside that I have to respond. So I'll respond to all of that and I do that. And unfortunately, even though, I talked with the publisher and stuff like that, and that was kind of like the deal, the book was quite delayed in the time frame that I wanted. It should have been out before COVID. But in any case, the deal was, they were interested in the book. It was approved through peer review. They made me an offer. I told them I want to also have it available online. And they said, no, we cannot do this because, this costs money and we have to make the money. And I said, no, I understand. But then it's how much money, and then they gave me a number and then I paid that. And then, they had to kind of like agree to that. So that was
nice. That's funny. Yeah, you're like, okay, it costs a certain amount of money. How much? And then you're like,
exactly. Yes.
If it comes from me or from someone else, like that is just it can come to you. That's funny. That's cool that that is really putting your money where your mouth is. Was it like a desire to have it be open source, or was it the speed that you wanted it, or why would you pay money to give your book for folks up to free on the internet?
I think there's like a few things. One is, of course, like I do like making it accessible, and in particular, like to me, one of the things is that I grew up in Chile where books are expensive. They almost never get there. Some books would simply just don't get there. So it's a world that I grew up buying, MATLAB on the sidewalk, so,
Nice.
as well as the video games and all of that stuff, and so to me, I always, when I think about what I'm doing, I think kind of like beyond the US and European audience, and I think like, hey, maybe there is like an 18-year-old in Indonesia that likes these topics, might be interested, because he saw like a talk of mine on YouTube or something. And if he wants to get the book, I don't want him to get like a pirate version. If he can get like the legit version and I can make that happen, That's good. I wanted also, to see if by doing this I could get the book to spread more broadly, and to reach a larger audience. At the same time, I think the book has been well received, but I don't think it has the impact that I expected. It has been a hard year to promote books, because there's a lot of books out there. There are no, speaking events. Everything is online. So that has been complicated, but I think that the fact that people like what is out there, a lot of people are interested in, it means that little by little, the word of mouth is going to hopefully make its job, and the book hopefully is going to become a reference for people that say, hey, I want to know how people judge humans and machines in this scenario. Let's see if among these 80 something I find one, that I can use, as a story that I can put in my journalistic article, or that I can cite on my paper, etc.
Yeah, I like that. I think I think I commend you for doing it. I think it's a really cool idea, and I haven't seen that many. Sometimes people will do a sliding scale if they sell it through like Gumroad or something, but this is, I think, a pretty unique thing where it is going through a big publisher, and you've kind of paid the publisher in order to have a PDF copy online. It also, yeah. So I think that's cool. As we get into wrap up mode here. Hey, let's talk about Why Information Grows, a book that you wrote in 2013 or something like that. When was
it? It was published in 2015. Yeah,
2015. Okay, sweet. I think it's a delightful book, and I especially enjoyed some of the talks around it. And I think that we've been chatting around it in the first part of our conversation here. But one thing, just kind of in general, that I want to ask you about is like, how do you think about information storage and information processing of, like human and social systems or these informational systems?
So in some way, what the book tries to do is two things. On the one hand, it tries to like generalize the idea of computational information by describing it at multiple scales and in multiple systems. So like information is a very fundamental physical property, is found in thermodynamic systems. Is related to entropy, which is a thermodynamic state variable. And then it was, years later rediscovered, in the theory of communication from Shannon and Nyquist, and eventually, we now understand that information is related to the way in which we would, encode something in physical order, whether it is, little magnetic domains in a hard drive, whether it is, the sound waves that we transmit as we speak across a room, and there is sort of like this very fundamental physical quantity that we are producing in great quantities in society. Biology also produces a lot of it, like DNA. In a way, is a molecule that is very rich in information, and that to do so requires certain cost. Like you need to, in some way, spend energy and exude entropy to kind of like produce information. It's kind of like running a little bit like a refrigerator. That you're running kind of like a little bit thermodynamics backwards. To create order, to keep it organized, and we do that all day, inside our bodies, and we do it in our society as well. So one of the things that the book tried to do is to say, okay, look, this is how people think about information in, when you're thinking about just like, physics, like spin glasses and, molecules and very simple things, go a little bit, through biology, but it moves quickly into society. And into the idea that a lot of our economy is based on creating these packets of information, but packets of information that are not just there to communicate meaning, but to communicate the practical uses of knowledge. So when we build a video camera, a projector, a telephone, a jacket, a pair of shoes, a dishwasher, these are also things that we create by going against, thermodynamics. We're kind of like locally reducing entropy, to create those objects. So it's, a dishwasher is in some way like a molecule of DNA, thermodynamically speaking, and by doing those things, we can communicate the practical uses of our knowledge. We can communicate the ability, to do things that seem like magic, to fly, to communicate at long distances, to travel really fast across space, to produce vast amounts of food, all of those things. And the other thing that the book does beyond connecting, this idea across scales and systems, is to say, well, when we're at the human and particularly the social scale, there are certain limitations that we need to consider that involve the accumulation of the knowledge that we need to produce that information. And these limitations are there because knowledge is not like just one thing. It's not like a liquid that we can accumulate more of it. It's something that is extremely complex. It's very specific, very unique, and it has a lot of like specific parts, like a giant alphabet or a gigantic, periodic table. And to accumulate all of those different pieces that we need to do something, we need to accumulate that knowledge in networks of people, because simply individuals cannot learn enough. And then, I use that as a point of departure to start to explain, well, how do we form networks and how large network can be and how that depends on transaction costs, trust, and other things, and the ability to create these large networks is key to be able to accumulate large volumes of knowledge and to then create these complex things, that few people can create and that can make your geography richer. So then it goes from there to explain, the differences in wealth as differences in this capacity to accumulate knowledge in social and professional networks. And that's what the book is about. It's about the geography of knowledge, but starting, from the physics of information.
Yeah, I love that, and it's a cool, the connecting it across, disciplines and scales is it's a beautiful way to do it. And I think there's a lot more interesting stuff to be, I just love that frame of thinking about, these networks of humans as ways to kind of process information better in order to create this knowledge that can't just be stored in the human brain. So I think it's fascinating, interesting stuff there. Maybe as the final question here, Cesar, for listeners, definitely check out How Humans Judge Machines or Why Information Grows. And again, How Humans Judge Machines, just check out some of the visuals for it online. It's really cool what you were able to do there. Is there anything else that you kind of recommend to our listeners, either a place to find you on Twitter or anything like that?
No, yeah, of course, I'm not that hard to find online, but yeah, I would say, to visit the Center for Collective Learning. This is my new group that I started. It's a continuation of the collective learning group that I had at MIT, but now, we're growing into a center, and we're starting to explore, new ideas. Some of them continue the work that we've done on economic complexity and geography of knowledge, but we're also interested on digital democracy, and that's, I think, where you're going to probably see a lot of things coming out later this year and during the next one.
Beautiful. I mean, that sounds amazing. That's even just good for me to know. It's like, if you're interested in collective learning more generally, either on the economic complexity side or on this kind of civic tech, gov tech, like networks of folks processing information, boom, check out Cesar's place.
Thank you.
Beautiful. So thank you again, Cesar, and thank you listeners for coming by, and goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.